How do you date the Gospels? We start by asking them out for coffee. I'm hilarious, but seriously, there's probably two distinct ways of how you can date the Gospels. External, largely patristic writings, and internal. What do the Gospels say within themselves that would tell you what date they were written? And that's what I'm going to try to look out for today. That is the external. What do we know from outside of the Gospels that we could help understand when the Gospels were written, therefore get us a better understanding of what the Gospels are all about, to better understand the life of Jesus. By the way, we haven't met before. I'm Ryan, and yes, I am a carpenter. That's why you don't see a big library behind me, but that doesn't mean I can't read. It just means I got tools, not a library bookcase behind me, like all the other good scholars. So let's get into it. So, as a carpenter, how do we go about figuring this out? Well, my collect reference is back to blueprints. So, your blueprints, you got your whole pile of papers there. And generally speaking, you got your architectural plan view right off the top there. But within there, there's details in which you can zoom into exact dates. To think of this kind of to regards to the dating of the Gospels, we think of the exact dates like what does Origin or exact detail? What does Origin have to say about this? What does Irenaeus of Lyons have to say about this? And to keep it a little bit simpler, I'm going to keep it within the first 3 centuries of the patricic writings. Why? Because I think after that, there's kind of consensus and a regurgitation of information already presented. They're not really providing much new information after the 3rd century. I think I do have a quote from Jerome, just because it helps us understand. And you got to, yeah, help us understand the Gospel of Matthew, because he's one of the more peculiar, confusing one of all three. But let's get into it. Let's start with the Gospel of John. Let's do them in reverse order. So, the Gospel of John is largely considered the oldest Gospel, therefore, written the latest. Let's just get right into that one here. So, the Gospel of John, so the Muratorian fragment writes this: to his fellow disciples and bishops who had urging him to write his parenthesis, he said, "Fast with me for today for 3 days, and what will be revealed to each one, let us tell it to one another." In the same night, it was revealed to Andrew, one of the apostles, that John should write down all the things in his name, while all of them should review it. Okay, first of all, the Monitorium fragment is kind of like Bible study notes. It's from the 2nd or 3rd, maybe even the 7th or 8th century. So, a little bit of question mark on that. But needless to say, it has some very interesting details there at the beginning of the Gospels. But that being said, just the story we just read here does sound a little apocryphal. Is that the right word we're looking for? It's a great story. Can we really take it for what it's worth? Do you think John and Andrew were sitting around praying before they wrote the Gospels? Maybe they did. But if we trust this, so if we're going to trust this as true, this is one of our first dating, we have to go, okay, so John, lived the 1st century. I think we'll get to it. Probably dies around 98. But the Apostle Andrew, when is his tombstone? And we find out that he dies somewhere between 60 and 70 because we don't have a tombstone, but he dies within 60 and 70. So if this is true, that would mean the Gospel of John is written between somewhere around 60 to 70 AD. Now, like I said, we got our plans in front of us and we're looking at details, and sometimes our details will conflict. So here's where our conflict is going to come up here. So our next one comes from Irenaeus of Lyons. So he's roughly 2nd century. So just be upfront with you. He's the gold mine of ideas and things about the Gospels, because he's really deep into it. But let's just get into what he says. Afterwards, so that's added to his quote, other Gospels were written. So afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast. So he's very much clarifying who this is. Did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. Okay, so slightly different context here. So when is John in Ephesus? So again, Leon writes, or Irenaeus, the church in Ephesus founded by Paul, and having John remaining among them permanently until the time of Trojan, is a true witness of the tradition of the apostles. Okay, so we have established, so he knows about John being in Ephesus. So just, we got to get this kind of cleared up right off the bat here. You ever worked on commercial and residential sites? Well, I have. And in Canada here, one of the distinct difference is residential is the way it should be. All imperial, feet and inches. But in commercial sites, it's all in metric. Kind of like that. I don't know if you can see that on the tape there. So one of the challenges we're going to do right away with the dating of the Gospels is the ancients don't refer to things as 2026 or 1918 or any of those dates. They refer to them kind of like in the imperial in reference to the other thing. So when so-and-so was here, this happened. So that's what John has done here, or Irenaeus has said about John. So at the time of Trajan, and we know roughly from scholars is that he ruled between January 98 AD to August 117 AD. That's the time window here. But Eusebius writes that John the Apostle and Evangelist died at Ephesus in the 68th year after the Passion of the Lord at the age of 100. Woo! Well done, John. Well done. You lived 100 years according to Eusebius. So that roughly puts us, so if you take an earlier dating of the date Christ's crucifixion, 30 plus 68 gets us to 98. So John lived at least there till 98. We know that Paul planted his church there roughly at 57. And tradition, don't have a source for this one, but tradition has it that John arrived there in 70. So somewhere between 70 and 98, he wrote the gospel there. So just for the Patricians here, John is giving us, we have two rough dates for him, and we could possibly blend them here. So the first one is, I said two. We actually have three dates. First one is 98. So John's gospel is published right before he dies. Pay attention to that. The little one's a little bit earlier. So he gets exiled for the book of Revelations, authorship of the book of Revelations in 95. So maybe 98 or 95, he publishes the Gospel of John. Moratorian fragment, we have between 60 and 70 being Andrew's death. So that would put it way earlier, and it's possible you can work the two together. And this is where we do a little bit of harmonization, which sometimes is risky and sometimes it can be done. We could have John published in his Gospel right near the beginning of his time in Ephesus, not later. So shortly right after the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, which most scholars base off the dating of the Gospels, and that we could have it roughly written very close to the early 70s, which most scholars would disagree with, but we're not asking most scholars right now. We're asking what the patristic writers wrote, and they would say either around 70, maybe before the destruction of the temple. Maybe they'll look a little more internal to figure that one out. And the latest be in 98. Continuing to work backwards, at least backwards in how they're listed in the Bible. Luke is our next one. So right away, we've got Origen. So let's focus in on Origen here. So Origen writes, and third, which tells us pretty much where the order they should be in. So he thinks the third gospel is Luke, which it is in your Bibles. Was that according to Luke, the gospel commended by Paul, which he composed for the converts from Gentiles? Last of all, that according to John. So we have Origen. He says it's third. It's a third gospel. I would interpret that as third gospel written, but you could debate that. At first blush, So this was when the first we kind of read it. This is what I was kind of thinking. I thought that Paul had read the Gospel of Luke and actually commended it, aka used it. And this kind of fits with 1 Timothy 5:18, where it seems to be quoted in Luke 10:7. Put in a very early dating for Luke in somewhere between 62 and 67. And I'm going to tell you a reason for that a little bit later. But let's just jump ahead to Eusebius here. And so Eusebius commented about all those other people, and they say that the Paul was actually accustomed to quote from Luke's gospel whenever writing, as if the same gospel is his own. He said, according to my gospel. And this happens in Romans a couple times. So kind of what my first blush thought was is he's actually got a physical copy of the gospel. I'm not so convinced that Paul had a physical copy of the Gospel of Luke in which he used. I think a better way of understanding origin here is that the gospel that Luke preached, the gospel that Paul preached, Luke wrote his gospel in conformity to that. So the main structures of which Paul would put in his gospel being more than just the life of Jesus, but the preachings of Paul, Luke wrote a gospel that conformed that. And yes, there's some internal stuff that we should look at it for that, but just that's where we're going to kind of put it in. So back to following our tombstones then. Luke's tombstone is given roughly 84. So this is also in the Anti-Marcionite prologue to Luke. Again, kind of study Bible notes. So it writes, Luke, a Cyrene of Antioch, a physician by profession, a disciple of the apostle, later followed Paul until his martyrdom. He served the Lord without distraction, having neither wife nor children. He died in Beatia at the age of 84, full of the Holy Spirit. We have a window, if we take traditional authorship, and that's another video for another time. We have a window of after Paul, so Paul is executed roughly at 64, and no later than 84. So we have those 20-year window there that Luke possibly could have written according to our patristic witnesses. So let us continue. So next up is the Gospel of Mark. Gospel of Mark is a very interesting one in regards to dating it. It's a little harder to nail down, maybe not, but anyways, I'll get to that one a little bit later. So Gospel of Mark, one of our first details we look at, or first witnesses, is Clement of Alexandria, who writes roughly around 200 to 202 AD. It's a long time away from the original writing of the Gospels, but still, it's fairly close. So Clement of Alexandria, as recorded by Eusebius, writes, as Peter had preached the word publicly at Rome and declared the gospel by the Spirit, many who were present requested that Mark, who had followed him for a long time, and remembering his sayings, should write them out. And having composed the gospel, he gave it to those who had requested. When Peter learned of this, he neither directly forbade it nor encouraged it. That's interesting. So he is still Peter being alive here, which gives us a window between 42 and 64. And I'll explain 42 a little bit later. But 64, again, most people consider that when Nero's persecution broke out, he executed Paul and Peter. Therefore, they're no longer around. So if Peter's able to hear his gospel that Mark writes out, it could be no later than 64. But this other powerful witness, so flipping over to our other detail, is Irenaeus of Lyons. And he gives a slightly different take. So pay attention here. After there, so there we know from the context is Peter and Paul departure. Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, so kind of the same concept happened here, also did hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Okay, so he has it happening after Peter's and Paul's execution. So after 64. You could try to harmonize Clement and Irenaeus. I don't know if there's much value to doing that, but if you were going to harmonize it, you'd probably do it this way. So Clement of Alexandria is referring to the rough draft copy of the Gospel of Mark. So Peter reads that over, gets executed, and then Mark actually publishes his finished draft. Probably just tweaks a few words here, nothing significant. So that's one way you can make those two work together, because we have a post-mortem date and a pre-mortem date. But there's one more mortem date that actually matters here too, and that is Mark. So if we accept traditional authorship, Mark is executed in 68. So really, that's what I'm saying. We don't much room for debate there. So earliest 42, I'll get back to that one a little bit later, but more likely between 64 and 68, the Gospel of Mark is written. Going down our list here, we're at our fourth and final Gospel. Clement of Alexandria gives us a quick clue here of actually the sequence of the order the Gospels were written. He writes, the Gospels contain the genealogies, he said, were written first. So again, we get all our notes from Clement of Alexandria through Eusebius, our great gatekeeper. So which Gospel starts with the genealogy? This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. So that's the very beginning of it. There's some confusion about genealogy because in our canonical Gospels, there's two Gospels that have genealogies, Matthew and Luke, which does make it a little bit complicated, but we're just going to go with Matthew here for now. That being said, Matthew is the hardest one, at least for me, to figure out when it was written and what was written down. Let me explain what I mean by that. But first of all, let's get to Origen. So Origen also spent time in Alexandria, which is something to keep in mind. That a lot of this happens down near Egypt, but of course, Irenaeus of Lyons is Lyons. Trying to pronounce it with my French, is more in what our current France area. So two different parts of the Mediterranean. Origen writes, I have learned by tradition. So right away telling you who's learned this from. So this is hearsay. Tradition is hearsay. Doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's hearsay. He's not looking at a document and saying, oh, this is when it was written. You see Matthew said through hearsay. So through tradition, he has learned that the gospel according to Matthew, who was at one time a publican and afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ, was written first. All right. So Origen also is pretty sure it was written first. And that he composed it in the Hebrew tongue. There's much debate about that, but just place that pin somewhere, Hebrew tongue, and published it for the converts from Judaism. All right. So, like I said, other side of the Mediterranean, we jump over to Irenaeus of Lyons. Lyons. He writes, Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect. In their own dialect. That's important to hear. While Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundation of the church against, so this is recorded in Against Heresies, Book 3, Chapter 1 of Irenaeus of Lyons. So he places the writing of the Gospel of Matthew similar to the time frame of the writing of the Gospel of Mark. So we have Peter and Paul both in Rome, and he thinks that's roughly when it was written. So when do we know those things happen? We know that Paul, he first arrives in Rome around 60, 61. You know, the end of Acts. In the end of Acts, is that chapter 28? Oh, I don't remember. But anyways, the end of Acts, he arrives in Rome. And we also know that he's martyred at 64. Well, there's some debate about that. 64 or 67. He's martyred. So Peter, there is a tradition. Remember, like Origen who learned the tradition. There's a tradition that he arrived around 42 or 44 CE. Yes, common era. So roughly about 12 years after Jesus' crucifixion. And the reason they want that is they want Peter in Rome for 25 years. Which I'm not quite sure why they're so set on 25 years, but that's very important to the tradition there. There's actually a clue about this. So in 1 Peter 5:13, he writes from Babylon, which most interpreters understand he's talking about the capital of the world, the evil harlot, Babylon, aka Rome. So he writes about that in 1 Peter 5:13. And again, we have Peter being martyred in 64 under Nero. So then we have our window there of when both Paul and Peter are in Rome between 60 to 64 that Matthew is written. Maybe 67 the latest, but between 60 and 64. So that's pretty clear. Except, we still have one problem. So you've probably, which I have also, read the Gospel of Matthew in English. Yeah, I'm assuming you're reading it in English. Or some other translation. But the gospel that was translated from is Koine Greek. Oh, Koine Greek. That's not Hebrew. No, not Aramaic. Koine Greek. So this is a big hang-up because I'm going to go through a few more witnesses here of why this is so important to understand. Again, Eusebius quotes Patrician, who writes this. So Patrician is a missionary. He was the teacher of Clement of Alexandria, who's getting all these other notes about the Bible from, or about the Gospels, around 180 to 190. He travels to India, which gets a little bit confusing because their India could be Southern Arabia, it could be Ethiopia, it might be India, like modern day India, but anyways, he travels somewhere. So this is what he writes. He found that the gospel according to Matthew, all right, it's progress here, it's getting out before him, had anticipated his arrival upon some who had known Christ, to whom Bartholomew, another one of the apostles, had preached, and had left with them the writings of Matthew. Excellent! They got the gospel in Hebrew letters, which writing they had preserved until that time. So again, we have these Hebrew letters. This isn't Hebrew style. This is Hebrew letters. Jerome also repeats this story in that he sees these Hebrew letters. More famously, Jerome actually, so this is around 390 CE, so near the end of the 4th century, almost into the 5th century, he writes, Matthew first composed the gospel of Christ in Judea in the Hebrew language and characters. Just in case you didn't get it. So Jerome is saying Hebrew language and character. He's trying to be very clear. It's in Hebrew. The Hebrew itself is preserved to this day in the library of Caesarea. We get that from illustrious men. So Jerome, roughly at the end of the 4th century to the beginning of the 5th century, claims that there is a copy of the Hebrew. There's a copy of the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew in Caesarea at his time. Unfortunately, we don't have that, but he is pretty clear that he has a Gospel of Matthew, but it's in Hebrew. So as I see it, that then brings us all the way back full circle to Eusebius's earliest testimony we have of the source of the Gospel of Matthew. And I'll read it for you again because I've heard many explanations of what this means, but everything we heard from Jerome and all these other guys, Alexandria, let's keep that in mind. So let me read it here one more time. So Eusebius records Papias wrote. So Papias lived somewhere between 60 and 130, and he writes, Matthew, he has made the following statements. Matthew put together the oracles in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted them as best as he could. Yes, I've heard many arguments of style. I just don't think it fits with the evidence because there were later witnesses who were finding manuscripts written in Hebrew. This is Hebrew, so we've got to keep that in mind. Jerome, who does live later than Eusebius, does offer an explanation, and he writes, in Illustrious Men on chapter 3, he writes, Matthew also called Levi, so he's combining the two from both gospel sources, apostle and a four times publican, composed a gospel of Christ at first published in Judea in Hebrew for the sake of those who circumcised who believed. But this was afterwards translated into Greek. Thou by what author is uncertain. The Hebrew itself has been preserved until the present day at the library at Caesarea, where Pamphlus so diligently gathered. So I don't know what to do with that, and I don't know what to do with what Jerome is saying. But he is saying that there was a translation work done. The debate is, was what Matthew first written only the sayings of Jesus, or was it a gospel of Matthew similar to what we have now? And there's a lot of internal weeds we got to get into to figure that out. But that is something to keep in mind. But as we continue on to try to find out what the timing of what it was written, again, this is all going to be regarding in regards to the Hebrew language. So Eusebius records, for Matthew, who had first preached to the Hebrews, when he was about to go to the other peoples, committed his gospel to writings in his native tongue, and thus compensated those whom he was obliged to leave for the loss of his presence. And when Mark and Luke had already published their gospel, they say that John. So he's kind of listing out the order of which they're written. And he's saying that Matthew wrote before he left Judea. Okay? So we already kind of established that. But roughly what timing is that bringing into our modern calendar? So Clement of Alexandria is using a manuscript which most of us would say is not trustworthy, and that is the Kerygma Petra, aka the preaching of Peter, which has the apostles remaining in Jerusalem for 12 years. Let me read it here. If any one of the Israelites then wish to repent and by my name to believe in God, his sin shall be forgiven him. After 12 years, go forth in the world, that no one may say, we have not heard. So roughly 12 years after the death of Jesus is roughly between 42 and 45, depends if you date 30 or 33 as Jesus' death. We also have the Council of Jerusalem, which is recorded in Acts 15 in AD 44. So if we have them dispersing after that, we have Matthew sitting down and writing a gospel roughly between 42 and 45, which does conflict with Irenaeus of Lyons, who suggests more between 60 and 67. So we have two different dates presented to us, and we kind of got to discern which one. There is a way of harmonizing it. If that's what you want to do, this is how I would do it. I would say the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, more the sayings of Jesus, were written down roughly between 42 and 45 AD. And then Irenaeus of Lyons is confusing the translation work. So when we get the gospel that we know, the Gospel of Matthew, which comes together in place roughly between, what do we say, 62 and 67, similar to the time of the writing of Mark. And yes, I'm going to argue some connection there, but let's just move on. Let's just recap what we know here. Of all the Gospels, if we just do the external witnesses for the first few centuries, we notice a pattern here. Largely speaking, written text occurs when someone is about to depart or does depart. Paul's about to be executed, Luke writes. Peter's about to be executed, or after his execution, Mark writes. Matthew's about to leave Jerusalem, he writes. John, a little bit more of a question mark. If we take earlier dating, not if we take later dating, he's about to die, he writes. So we still have to figure out this logia of Matthew, but then, like I was just saying earlier, I think it's somewhere between 60 and 67 that he writes, or the earlier dating 42 to 45, the actual Hebrew sayings of Jesus, which unfortunately we have lost to time. Mark, writing roughly around Peter's martyrdom, between 64 and 68, and eternally these have to be kind of lined up, but we'll get to that later. Luke, writing between 62 and 67. It could be as late as 84, just being the death of Luke. I don't think that's required. I think an earlier dating could happen. And then you have John. Again, there are two big debates is Which source do we take as more accurate? He's either writing between 60 and 70 when the Apostle Andrew is still alive, or, as Irenaeus of Lyons and Eusebius seem to suggest, between 70 and 95 being a very late dating of the Gospel of John. But it is entirely possible, if we were to pick one date, that we could have all four Gospels, according to these witnesses, being written around 64 AD. And it doesn't require long decades between the Gospel writings for the Gospels to be published and rewritten. It could be as simple as a follower of Paul, who does have a slightly different perspective on the life of Jesus, sits down with his manuscripts, the research that he has done over the last few years, and quickly compiles a gospel roughly at the same time, kind of creating a publishing frenzy at that time to get a written manuscript, to get a written telling of the life of Jesus. And that kind of brings us back into where we need to get into the eternal evidence, which is next. Not in this video. This is already long enough. But which wrote first kind of has to be established, because that kind of establishes our order of which the Gospels were produced. It seems like all sources say John was written last, so we know that's our one at the end. Then the question is which one was written first? Except for the Jerusalem school, I think I've heard of, suggest that Luke was written first. Almost everyone says it's either Mark or Matthew, and then how they compile after that, we kind of get a sense of when they were written. Thanks for sticking in so long. Please give it a thumbs up. I'll see you in the next one.